My name is Camille, and I am 32 years old. For as long as I can remember, my family had one name for me, the stubborn one. Not the ambitious one, not the determined one, the stubborn one. Said with a sigh, said with a head shake, said like a diagnosis no one had the patience to treat. My brother Marcus got every celebration our family had to offer. He graduated from Morehouse with honors, and my parents threw a party so elaborate that the neighbors 3 streets over called to ask if they needed extra parking. When he passed the bar exam, my mother cried the kind of tears that come from a place of pure, overflowing pride. When he got engaged to a woman named Brittany, a woman who smiled with her whole face but watched everyone else in the room with cold This is what we raised him for. I sat at the end of that same table and said nothing. I had learned a long time ago that saying something only gave them material. My parents were not cruel people in the way that strangers sometimes are. They were cruel in the way that only the people who love you can be thoughtlessly, casually, without ever once considering the weight of what they were placing on another person's shoulders. When I chose not to go to law school, my father called it a waste. When I started my own consulting firm at 24, my mother called it reckless. When I moved to Atlanta and stopped attending every family event with my head bowed, they called me difficult. The stubborn one. I want you to understand what that label does to a person when it starts, before you are old enough to defend yourself against it. It doesn't arrive like a wound. It arrives like weather, gradual and total. You don't notice how thoroughly it has soaked into you until you're standing somewhere alone, and you realize you have been apologizing for your own existence for years. I stopped apologizing the year I turned 27. By 32, I had built something my family didn't have the framework to understand, and I had done it entirely without their belief in me, which, it turned out, was the only inheritance that ever actually mattered. This is the story of the day they finally saw what I had built. Marcus's engagement party was held at a rooftop venue in Atlanta's Buckhead neighborhood, a place my mother had selected specifically because it had been featured in a magazine she kept on her coffee table. The venue was beautiful. I will give her that. Warm amber lighting, a long table draped in ivory linen, the Atlanta skyline glittering behind it, all like something out of a movie. I arrived alone. I always arrived alone at family events, not because I didn't have people in my life, but because bringing someone into my family's orbit felt like an act of unkindness I wasn't willing to commit. My closest friend Denise had offered to come. I told her no. I told her I could handle it. I almost believed myself. The first hour was exactly what I had prepared for. My mother greeted me with a hug that lasted 2 seconds, I counted, and then immediately pivoted to asking whether I'd had time to settle down yet. My father shook my hand the way he shook the hands of people he recognized but couldn't quite place. Marcus hugged me with genuine warmth, because Marcus had always been genuinely fond of me, which made everything more complicated than it would have been if he had simply been as dismissive as our parents. It was Brittany who made the first move. She did it softly, the way women like her always do. She was standing with a group of family friends, and I heard her voice carry across the rooftop with the particular clarity of someone who knows exactly how far sound travels. She said, "I just think it's so admirable, honestly. Not everyone is built for the corporate world. There's nothing wrong with small businesses. Someone has to do them." She was talking about me. Everyone in that circle knew she was talking about me. She smiled at me from across the room the moment she said it, that full, bright, calculated smile, and I smiled back, because I had learned to keep my cards until the right moment. That moment had not yet arrived. My Aunt Renata found me at the appetizer table 20 minutes later. She squeezed my arm with genuine affection and whispered, "Don't let them get to you, baby." I appreciated that. Renata was the one person in my family who had watched me grow up and drawn conclusions based on actual evidence rather than expectation. She had called me the week I launched my firm's 3rd major client contract and said, "I always knew it was going to be you." I had held on to those words for years like something precious. The evening moved the way these evenings always do. Toasts were made. My father's toast to Marcus lasted 11 minutes. I timed it on my phone under the table and contained 3 separate references to legacy and 2 to the family name. There was no mention of me, not in passing, not even as an aside. I had shown up. I had dressed beautifully. I had smiled at the right moments. And I remained, as I had always been in this family's official story, invisible. Then the venue manager appeared at my father's elbow with an expression I recognized immediately, the controlled panic of someone delivering bad news to someone who doesn't look like they handle bad news well. He bent low and spoke quietly. My father's face shifted in a way that had nothing to do with the champagne he had been sipping. I watched him absorb whatever he had just been told, and then I watched him look across the table at Marcus with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It was the expression of a man who has just been told the floor is not where he thought it was. I found out what had happened from my cousin Devin, who had been standing close enough to hear. The card my parents had used to secure the venue deposit and the remaining balance of $68,000 had been declined. Not the card itself, but the account behind it. My parents had restructured some investments recently, moved money around in anticipation of paying for the engagement party, and something had gone wrong in the timing. The account was temporarily frozen, pending a transfer that hadn't cleared. $68,000. Due tonight in full, or the venue would be filing a claim against the deposit and escorting the guests out within the hour. I watched my father stand up from the table with the careful, controlled movement of a man, trying very hard not to let anything show on his face. I watched my mother follow him to the edge of the rooftop where the manager was waiting. I watched Marcus notice, and then look at Brittany, and then look down at his hands. I sat with it for exactly 4 minutes. Then I stood up, straightened my dress, and walked to where my parents were standing. My father saw me coming and held up one hand, a reflex, like redirecting traffic, and said, "Camille, this is not the moment." I said, "I know what happened." My mother turned. Her expression was the one she used when she wanted to appear composed but couldn't quite finish the job. She said, "This is a private matter." I said, "I'd like to take care of it." The silence that followed that sentence had weight. My father looked at me the way he might look at someone who had just made a joke in poor taste. My mother's eyes moved to my hands, to my dress, to my face, looking for the evidence that I was somehow misunderstanding the scale of what I was offering. I took out my phone, opened my banking app, and turned the screen so my father could see the number in my primary operating account. I will tell you something, friends, and I mean this, in the way that only a person who has spent 32 years being underestimated can mean it. There is a specific silence that falls over a room when someone reveals that the person who was never supposed to amount to anything has, in fact, amounted to something that rearranges the entire story. It is not a happy silence. It is not an angry silence. It is the silence of a structure being quietly dismantled. My father looked at that number for a long time. Then he said, quietly, "Camille." Just my name, nothing else, as though the word itself had changed meaning. I called the venue manager over, authorized the payment, and watched $68,000 leave my account the way pocket change leaves most people's. Then I went back to the table, sat down, and finished my champagne. The party continued. But something in the room had shifted, and everyone felt it, and no one spoke about it directly. Because that is how my family has always operated, everything acknowledged sideways, nothing addressed head-on. It was Brittany who addressed it head-on. She waited until after the dessert course, when the group had loosened and the music had softened and people were standing in small clusters rather than seated formally. She found me near the rooftop railing with my second glass of wine and a view of Peachtree Street 30 floors below, and she stood beside me for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "So how much does a little consulting firm actually make?" I looked at her. I said nothing. She pressed. She was the kind of woman who interpreted silence as an invitation. She said, "I'm just curious. Because that was a lot of money to just throw around like that. Where does that even come from?" I said, "Work." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. She said, "I hope you're not expecting that to buy you something in this family, Camille. You know how they see you. That's not going to change because you paid a bill." I turned and looked at her fully, for the first time that evening. I said, "Brittany, I'm going to say this once. I didn't pay that bill for them. I paid it for Marcus. And the difference between you and me is that I understand which one of those things matters." Something crossed her face. She left the railing. 3 minutes later, Marcus appeared in her place. He stood beside me the way he used to stand beside me when we were children, sharing a bench at church close, unhurried, like the space between us was something comfortable. He said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know." He said, "I should have known." I said, "Yes, but you didn't. And here we are." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you actually do, Camille? Not the version Dad tells at dinner. What do you actually do?" He said, and I told him. I told him about the firm I had built from a single consulting contract at 24, about the years of 18-hour days and cheap apartments and decisions that had looked reckless from the outside and felt like survival from the inside. I told him about the partnership I had finalized 14 months earlier, a majority stake in a logistics technology company that had, since the finalization, tripled in valuation. I told him the number, the real number. Not the operating account. The full picture. Marcus looked at the Atlanta skyline for a long time after I told him. He said, "Does Mom know?" I said, "No." He said, "Does Dad know?" I said, "He has a number on a screen. He doesn't know what it means yet." We stood there together for a while without speaking. Below us, the city moved and glittered, indifferent and enormous, and I felt something I had not expected to feel that evening. Not triumph, not vindication. Something quieter than both of those things. Something that felt, if I am honest, like grief, because the family that had called me the stubborn one for 30 years was not going to become a different family just because I had proven the label wrong. The label would simply get quieter. And that was not the same thing as healing. It was close to 10 o'clock when the next piece of the evening revealed itself. My father found me near the bar. He was holding a glass of bourbon he had not been drinking, turning it slowly in his hands the way he did when he was working through something too large to say directly. He said, "I want to talk to you." I said, "All right." He said, "Your mother and I have been thinking about restructuring the family trust. There are some decisions that need to be made about the property in Savannah and the investment accounts. We'd like you to be involved." I looked at him. I said, "You'd like me to be involved?" He said, "You clearly have a financial mind that we didn't." He stopped. He started again. "We would value your perspective. I want you to understand what it feels like, friends. To be offered a seat at a table where you spent your entire childhood being told you didn't belong. It does not feel like victory. It feels like standing in a doorway looking into a room and recognizing that the furniture has not moved an inch, only the light has changed. The room is the same room. The people are the same people. What has changed is only what they need from you." I said, "Dad, I am happy to have a separate conversation about the trust. But I need you to understand something first." He waited. I said, "I did not build what I built to earn a place in this family. I built it because I believed in myself when no one else here did. And I want you to hear me say clearly that those two things, what I have and what I needed from you as a child, are not connected anymore. One of them is mine. The other one is something I've had to let go of. And I'm not going to pretend that paying a $68,000 bill tonight means we don't have things to talk about that have nothing to do with money." My father looked at me for a long moment. His face did something complicated. Then he said, "You sound like your grandmother." I said, "Good." He nodded once, slowly, and then he said, and I did not expect this, not from him, not standing on a rooftop in Buckhead with a glass of bourbon and 30 years of silence between us, he said, "I think we were wrong about you. I think we let Marcus's path become the only path we could see, and I think that cost you something it shouldn't have." It was not an apology, it was adjacent to one. It was the closest my father had probably come to one in his entire life. I stood with it, and I decided it was enough for tonight. Not because it resolved everything, but because it was real. And real is rare in my family. My mother found us together and looked between us with the wariness of a woman who knows a conversation has happened that she wasn't present for. She said, "What are you two talking about?" My father said, "Camille." My mother looked at me. She said, "I owe you a thank you. For tonight." I said, "You don't owe me anything, Mom." She said, "I want to say it anyway." I said, "All right." She said, "Thank you." And then, after a pause that contained about 20 years of unspoken things, she said, "I don't think I ever told you that you were capable. I should have. Even when I didn't understand what you were doing, I should have told you that I believed you were capable of doing it." I did not cry. I had made a decision years ago about where I would and would not spend my tears, and a rooftop in Buckhead was not on the list. But I felt the words land somewhere deep and stay there. And I think that was the most I could offer her in that moment. Brittany, as it happened, was not finished. I had moved to a quieter corner of the rooftop near the end of the evening, saying my goodbyes in small increments the way you do when you've been performing a version of yourself for 5 hours and the performance is nearly done. She appeared behind me while I was getting my jacket from coat check, and she said, loud enough for the small cluster of family members nearby to hear, "I just think it's interesting that it takes money for this family to finally pay attention to you. Must be a lonely way to live." There it was. I turned around slowly. The nearby family members had gone very still. I looked at Brittany with the calm of someone who has long since stopped needing the approval of rooms she walks into, and I said, "Brittany, you've been working very hard tonight to make me feel small. I noticed the first time and I let it go. I'm not going to let it go a second time." She opened her mouth. I continued, "I am not in competition with you. I am not in competition with Marcus. I am not in competition with anyone in this family. I built something on my own, with no help from any room I grew up in, and what you are describing as loneliness is what the rest of the world calls independence. I hope at some point you learn the difference." She stared at me. I got my jacket. I said goodnight to my Aunt Renata, who squeezed my hand and said nothing and said everything. I said goodnight to Marcus, who hugged me for a long time and said quietly into my shoulder, "I'm proud of you. I'm sorry it took me this long to say it." I said, "Don't apologize. Just mean it going forward." He said, "I do." I believed him. I took the elevator down 30 floors alone, walked out onto Peachtree Street into the warm Atlanta night, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the city moving around me. My phone buzzed. It was Denise. Her text said, "How'd it go?" I stood there thinking about how to answer that. The honest answer was that it had gone the way honest reckonings go, not the way you want them to, not with the clean resolution of a story that ties itself up, but with the messy and genuine and irreplaceable sensation of having told the truth in a room that had been built on something else, and watching what that truth does to the walls. I texted Denise back. It went, "Come over. I'll tell you everything." I started walking to my car, and somewhere in the space between one block and the next, I felt the last of it, the old weight, the carried label, the stubborn one, the reckless one, the one who didn't fit the plan. I felt it get lighter. Not gone. You don't put down 30 years in a single night. But lighter. Here is what I know, friends. The people who label you earliest are not always wrong because they are malicious. Sometimes they are wrong simply because they are limited. Because they can only see the roads they already know, and you are being built for a road that doesn't exist yet, one that you will have to lay yourself, one stone at a time, in the dark, with no one watching. And the thing about laying that road alone is this: when the people who doubted you finally arrive at the beginning of it and look down its length and realize where it goes, you don't need them to validate the destination, because you have already been there. You have already built a life at the end of it that belongs entirely to you. They called me the stubborn one. They were not wrong. They just didn't understand that stubborn, in the right hands, is another word for relentless. And relentless, it turns out, is the only thing you ever needed to be. The labels other people stick on us when we're young were never really about us. They were about the limits of whoever was doing the labeling. Camille didn't prove her family wrong by becoming wealthy. She proved them wrong the moment she kept moving forward without their permission. Whatever room has been withholding its applause from you, remember, you were never waiting on their approval to be worth something. A small note for you: this story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you a moment of entertainment while leaving behind something that might actually be useful to carry into your day.